When most people think about the internet, what they're actually thinking about is the World Wide Web. They're not thinking about a global network of computers connected via vast lengths of cable all over the globe. They're thinking about the websites they access every day. That's because for many of us, the first place where we discovered the usefulness of the internet and then fell in love with it was the web. And the history of the internet shows that fact. It was the invention of the web and the web browser that really saw internet use explode globally beyond just academic institutions. So what is the World Wide Web? Besides being a great place to go on a website doom spiral of self-diagnosing your headache as a definitely fatal tumor. And what are the processes that make this intoxicating informational feast possible? Let's get into it. One of the key concepts that made the web possible was hypertext. This was a term first coined in the 1960s by a man named Ted Nelson, where he proposed the idea of being able to create and use linked content. The concept of being able to click on a word and have it take you to a related page of information is so familiar to us now. But try and imagine for a moment how huge and new that idea was. The possibilities it opened up for accelerating research, learning, and simple exploration. Nothing like this had existed before. And it was this idea and the potential of it that inspired Tim Berners-Lee, a computer scientist working at CERN in Switzerland in the late 1980s. At the time, CERN was the largest internet node in Europe, and he found himself frustrated by the problem of how difficult it could sometimes be to find or update data in such a large computer network. If there was some way to simply display information for easy access that could then easily link directly to related information, navigating the vast amount of information and research happening there would be so much easier. It would also make sharing that information with other users outside the CERN network so much easier. And hypertext was the perfect solution to this problem. He first made a proposal to his managers at CERN in 1989 of the idea for an information system using the internet and hypertext to make documents and other information accessible. His manager at the time called his proposal vague but exciting. He teamed up with another computer scientist named Robert K. Liu, who had independently proposed a similar hypertext system for CERN. And by 20th December 1990, they had created the world's first web page. To make this possible, they also created the world's first web browser software called World Wide Web and the world's first web server. The site held information on what the World Wide Web concept was, how you could use a web browser, and how to build your own website. The idea was quickly adopted by CERN and other academic institutions, and by 1993 there were 500 known web servers. By 1994, with the creation of new web browsers that made the web more accessible, there were over 10,000, which gives you an idea of how quickly this idea exploded. But how does all this even work? Let's walk through the process of how we would access a website today to try and explain it. Firstly, you would open the piece of software we call a web browser. This could be Chrome, Safari, Firefox, or Edge, amongst others. A web browser is quite simply an application for accessing websites. Using the set of rules known as the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, it retrieves website data via the internet from the server where it is held, and displays it in a readable format for the user. So your browser is not the web. It is the application that lets you access and read all the data that makes up the web, which is only accessible because of the network we call the internet. But what is the Hypertext Transfer Protocol? Well, we've come across this word protocol before when we were discussing internet protocols last episode. Well, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or HTTP, was a set of protocols designed by Tim Berners-Lee, built as a layer on top of the transmission control protocols we discussed previously. At its simplest, it's called a request-response protocol, whereby the client, the web browser, sends a request to a server holding website data, and that server in turn responds with the requested data. There is a lot more details to be discussed here in how HTTP functions and solves various problems, but that is the basics that we need for now. And then we've said that word server a few times now without explaining it. A server is basically a computer that's sole function is to respond to requests for the data it holds. Quite literally, a server of data. And we'll have a server program running on it to facilitate responding to the data requests. So let's walk it back. You open your web browser, which you now understand is our gateway to be able to access the vast network of website data on the thousands upon thousands of web servers spread throughout the network we call the internet. These servers waiting for requests for their data from users using their browsers. So how do you find the data you want? The original and initially only way to find that data was to know the URL or web address of the website you wanted to visit. URL stands for Uniform Resource Locator and builds upon the idea of domain names that had already existed before Berners-Lee created the web. The simple idea of domain names was to make different locations on the internet more accessible. So instead of remembering the sequence of numbers that makes up an IP address, which we discussed last episode, you could just remember a word, like google.com. This works by something called the Domain Name System, or DNS, which can be thought of as the phone book of the internet, if you're old enough to remember what a phone book is. Whereby each domain name is connected to a specific IP address. So when you type in the URL of your desired website and hit enter, the first request that is sent is to a server called a DNS server. This responds to the domain name you've typed with the IP address location of the website. That IP address will be the location of the server that is holding the data for the website you wish to access, which in many cases could be physically located on a server on the other side of the world. Your request arrives at that server and it responds to your request by sending the data back to the unique IP address of your computer. And your web browser translates that data into a readable web page for you to enjoy. Wow! And via the wonders of hypertext, you are able to interact with various links on that page, each of which initiate that process again, sending requests to servers that respond with the data that is the web page. All of this enabling that wonderful hypnotic process whereby you start with reading about how to renew your driver's license, then 1 hour later come out of a trance wondering why you're watching a video about the migratory habits of the Alaskan moose. Now, while the intent of the domain name idea was to assist with ease of memorizing locations on the internet, by the time the web exploded, it became quite clear that a big barrier to entry was even knowing where to start. So some people began to build web pages that were like catalogued lists of web pages you could access via a hyperlink, sorted by topic. One of the most notable of these early sites was Jerry and Dave's Guide to the World Wide Web, which would become the tiny company you've never heard of called Yahoo. So if you wanted to look up the latest news, you could click that link and find a list of relevant news websites to visit. It was out of this idea that the first search engines were born. The first major search engine in the style that we would recognize was called JumpStation, created in 1993. It functioned by using a piece of software called a web crawler, still in use today by search engines, that automatically searches links on the internet and creates an index of the content it finds. Then there is the search function that allows you to search that index for keywords, returning back to you a list of websites that contained the word you searched. This created the reality we know today, where you could successfully navigate yourself to everywhere you want on the web while only needing to know one single URL. It's no wonder that search engines very quickly became big business, as not only did search engines fling wide the doors of accessibility to everybody, but also ranking and search results soon became critical. If you were relegated to the second page of the search results, you may as well not even exist. Because of this, paying search engines for greater visibility became a contentious topic, as the World Wide Web became the central hub around which almost all of our business and communications revolve. Your business could live or die dependent on where it appeared in search engine rankings. And with that, we've covered enough of the fundamental processes that make the internet possible. It's fascinating to review the journey we've taken over the last 22 episodes of exploring the process of how we communicate, and see all those different processes culminating in the internet. It began with the creation of language and writing, and instead of us eventually moving on from writing, it could be argued humans are now writing to each other more than any time in human history because of the internet. The invention of paper and its eventual standardizing in size and dimensions is still the unspoken driving factor behind the visual formatting of many web pages, and even the fact that they're named pages. The printing press brought us the revolutionary effects of the possibility of wide distribution of information and ideas, and the internet became that idea only now supercharged. The telegraph birthed the basic idea that the internet is still built on, that sending on-off electric signals over a wire would be capable of complex communication. And that is literally the basic thing that makes our connected internet possible. It's just large cables connecting computers. Only now we use fiber optic cables that transmit on-off signals of light at actual light speed along fibers of glass. The phone and the radio converted audio into varying electronic signals that could be transmitted, and the TV converted what we see into the same, both concepts still at play today in the internet and our screen age. The internet is truly the culmination of the history of humanity's need to communicate with each other, and the pursuit of connection over greater and greater distances. And it was made possible by the idea of process. As each new innovation came into being, the new process for communication has been passed on and spread amongst communities, with each new process unlocking new potential in our ability to communicate with each other, therefore unlocking fresh potential within us to create and connect. But we're still not done yet, because we are right now in the midst of a fundamental shift in the process of how we communicate. And we couldn't end this series without taking a look at some of the processes being developed as we speak that are about to change everything. So next time we will begin an exploration of artificial intelligence, the processes involved in it, and how it is completely changing how we communicate.